Hello everyone, today we're going to dive into the recently released Hamas document. I'm sure you guys saw it. It's essentially a manifesto titled Our Narrative, Al-Aqsa Flood, 2 Years of Steadfastness and the Will for Liberation. It's a 42-page publication put out by Hamas late last month that attempts to justify and reframe the events of October 7th, 2023, the day of Hamas's brutal attack on Israel, and the war that followed. In this video, I'm going to debunk this narrative point by point, stripping away the propaganda to reveal the truth. First, let's set the stage. What is this document? It's essentially Hamas's official account of its October 7th operation, which they codenamed Al-Aqsa Flood, and the subsequent conflict. It's written in a measured, moralistic tone, clearly targeting international audiences. Throughout its pages, Hamas uses human rights language, political buzzwords, trying to cast itself in a positive light and portray its actions as justified. And it's interesting how they use these political buzzwords, something that they didn't really use over 2 years ago during the Al-Aqsa Flood and right after. But they know they're going with the way the world has kind of helped justify their actions, so they're speaking their language. In other words, it's a propaganda piece, complete with total distortions, historical revisionism, moral inversions, and gross misrepresentations. Why should we care about some Hamas manifesto? Because it gives insight into how Hamas wants to shape the narrative, and it's important to challenge those lies with facts. Even if mainstream media didn't pay much attention to this document, perhaps to avoid amplifying terrorist propaganda, or maybe something more sinister, we must scrutinize and expose it. By examining Hamas's own words and claims, we can better understand their strategy of deception and ensure that the truth prevails. So let's break down the major claims Hamas makes in this manifesto and debunk each one. Claim number one. Right at the start, Hamas declares that Israel is a settler-colonial, genocidal entity. These are very loaded accusations, and we've heard it a lot from blue-haired leftists and pro-Palestinians in the West. But let's unpack them separately. Settler-colonial. Hamas tries to paint Israel as a foreign colonial implant with no legitimate indigenous ties. Of course, this is historically false. The Jewish people are indigenous to the land of Israel, historical Judea. Jews have maintained a continuous presence in that land for millennia. Far from being colonizers from a distant power, and the Zionist movement was largely made up of an exiled people returning to their ancestral homeland. Now, when we look at the idea of what is indigenous? Look, there's a lot of people that can individually come up with what they believe indigenous means. Unfortunately, a lot of people try to come up with their own definition to be disingenuous. So let's use colloquially, what do we use today? And the UN actually backs this up. There's actually 7 requirements of indigeneity. Now I want to make this simple. So I want to point out a couple of these things. All right, the Indigenous Peoples World Forum actually mimics these talks. One of the things I want to talk about is the section that says to form non-dominant groups within society. What does that mean? Well, funny enough, the person that actually came up with that was actually trying to use it in a way to discount Jewish indigeneity, but ironically, it actually can be used against the Arabs. Forming non-dominant groups within society means when there's a dominant group in your land, I don't know, Arabs in Judea, if you are indigenous to that land, you're going to you're going to keep to your own culture. You're not going to assimilate into the dominant population. You're going to form a non-dominant population within the society. So, the reason I bring this up is not for the Jews, but for the Palestinians. How many of you guys heard, well, actually, the Palestinians are not Arabs at all. They're Arabized, and technically they come from the Canaanites. Which tribe? Who knows? Who cares? But the Canaanites, trust me, bro. So here's the issue with that, is one, it's kind of funny that they used to say, even relatively recently, that they were actually the Philistines. And I think they said that because, to the best of my knowledge, Philistines sounded like Palestinian. They said, screw it, that sounds good enough for me. Except then they realized that the Philistines were actually invaders of that land, and they're from the island of Crete, most likely, so that didn't work out so well. So they said Canaanites. Why Canaanites and not anyone else that's lived in that land for even a very long time ago? Well, because they just had to pick someone that was there before the Jews. Now, what's their source? Well, the Jews. The book that Muslims specifically say is corrupted. It's where they actually get a lot of their information, including the name Philistines, by the way. We don't actually know what the Philistines call themselves, I don't think. They could have called themselves anything. Anyways, I'm ranting. So, forming non-dominant groups in society. Let's just pretend that they're telling the truth. Really, they come from the Canaanites. They love to pull up sources saying, well, this source says that there's a small percentage that they could be Canaanite. Except they don't really tell you when they got that DNA. Historically, when people would colonize a land, there would be unfortunate events, forced intermarriage, forced other things, and this could cause a shift in DNA. But again, let's pretend they're right. But then that means that they assimilated into the dominant population, in this case, Arab culture, meaning they gave up their indigenous claim. So it's interesting because they don't meet that requirement, even if they are right. Fun fact. But also, going into language, a distinct culture, the ethnogenesis of a people from pre-colonial times. Of course, colonial times in the context of the Levant goes back a lot farther than maybe talking about here in the beautiful and great United States of America. But nonetheless, they're not the original Canaanites. They don't meet that requirement. If they are somehow, well, they don't meet the forming non-dominant populations within society. You know who does, though? The Jews. Actually, throughout all of history, the Jews are one of the best, if not the best example of doing that, even in lands where they were in the diaspora. Anyways, so modern Israel's creation was internationally recognized. For example, United Nations 1947 Partition Plan 181. It was voted on November 29th, 1947. This recommended establishing a Jewish state alongside an Arab state, and you guys know this already. I'm sure you've seen a million videos. The Jews accepted the plan, Arab states rejected it, and launched a war. There was no European empire planting Israel as a colony. It's funny when they say that it's a colony of the British, America. Who? For it to be a colony, well, who are they a colony of? If you think about the original 13 colonies in the United States of America, if you asked who are they a colony of, well, you'd hear the British, and that'd be correct. So who's Israel a colony of? Hard question to answer. Israel was established by its native population and refugees returning home, its indigenous population. Meanwhile, if we talk about actual colonial powers in that region's history, we'd be listing ancient empires, the Babylonians, and the Romans, and then later the Ottoman Turkish empires, which came after the Mamluks and before the British Mandate. Not the Jews coming back to their homeland. So calling Israel a settler-colonial project ignores all of this history. But Nick, wasn't the early Zionist leaders, didn't they say that it was colonization or a colonial project? Yes, in terms of the late 1800s, when they talked about colonies, and if you don't believe me, you can look up the words of Lawrence of Arabia himself, who actually really would be labeled as a Zionist. He said that I'm paraphrasing here from my memory, but he said that the sooner the Jews farm it, the better, and their colonies are bright spots in this, I believe he said, desert. Well, why did he say colonies? Well, they talked about Arab colonies too. Wait, were they both colonial? What does it mean? In the late 1800s, colonies referred to literally a colony. It didn't have to do with if someone was colonizing in the colloquial sense that we say today. Like when we think of that, we think of imperialism, manifest destiny maybe, British Empire, French Empire, Ottomans, the Arabs. No, that's not what it meant. So yes, the early leaders did use these words, but we have to look at the context of, in this case, the late 1800s. Anyways, genocidal is the next claim. Hamas labels Israel as genocidal, implying that Israel is intentionally annihilating an entire people. It's paraphrasing the quote here. Think about the word genocide in the Genocide Convention of 1948, which was ratified in 1951. There's a special part that even a lot of pro-Israelis ignore, and that is dolus specialis. And what does that mean? Well, in layman's terms, it's special intent, meaning you cannot say that this action was for this cause or this reason, also could be used for genocide, so therefore it's genocide. No, it has to be with the intent to do genocide, not intent to destroy Hamas tunnels and hide behind their people. And well, but some people died, and we're calculating it this, times it by 10 because why not? And so therefore we're going to say that it's genocide. That's not what it means. Dolus specialis. You also have to meet two elements when thinking of genocide. The mental element, which is the really hard one to prove, the intent, and the physical element. So when they try to say, but, you know, there's this one guy who used to be in the government who said, I want to do this to all of the Arabs. Well, no, that's not genocide either. Although I can condemn that person and his words if they do say that. A lot of the times they lie about what people say. That's not what genocide means. Or, well, look at how many pregnant baby journalists have died. Well, again, it's not genocide. It has to be the intent. The dolus specialis has a special intent of genocide. This is an extremely serious charge. By definition, genocide means acts committed with the intent to destroy, whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. Does Israel's behavior fit this? No. In fact, Israel has taken pains not to harm civilians, even while fighting a war against Hamas, a terrorist organization that embeds itself among those civilians. How can we prove this? Well, there's a lot of ways. Okay, how about one? What does Zero themselves, Middle East Eye, believe? A lot of pro-Palestinian Arab sources say that something like 200,000 tons of explosives have been used on the Gaza Strip. All right, so is Israel indiscriminately or even discriminately bombing? Well, let's look at this. Let's say 200,000 tons. That would be 200,000 2,000-pound bombs, which are rarely used, especially compared to things like GBU-39s. So let's call it 400,000, maybe 500,000 for, let's go low. 400,000. It's a lot more than that, but let's just go with that. And of course it's explosive, so it includes even just like tank shells and other things, but let's go with this. So there's, according to Hamas, 70,000 dead. Now, that includes Hamas fighters that are dead. That includes collaborators that are dead. That includes PIJ, PRC, Army of Islam, PFLP, DFLP, Mujahideen brigades, others that collaborate with Hamas. And it includes civilians. So let's think about this. How many people, if it was indiscriminate bombing, meaning you are going to bomb, regardless of who's there, what's there, you're bombing that location. It's indiscriminate. Maybe you're aiming at Hamas. No, actually, even aiming would be discriminate. But maybe you're aiming at Hamas, but you don't really give a shit how many civilians are there. Okay, let's look at it. How many people could one explosive take out on average? Not the lowest number, not the most extreme number. On average, if it was indiscriminate bombing, meaning that they are going to hit that spot and they don't really care. In fact, maybe they don't even know which spot they're going to hit. They're just dropping bombs. Bloop, bloop, bloop. Be 150 people? Let's call it 10. Let's call it 5. Okay, let's just call it 5. So 400,000 times 5, that's 2 million, right? 400,000 times 10, 4 million times 2, 2 million. 2 million people. That is about the entire population of Gaza. And that was using extremely conservative numbers. Conservative in both amount of explosives, conservative in how many just one explosive would kill, whether it be a 2,000-pound bomb, tank shell, or anything in between. The average. By the way, I didn't even go into ground operations. I didn't even count bullets yet. Bullets! And it comes out to about the entire population of Gaza. You cannot have it both ways. You cannot say it's indiscriminate and then also say, well, the numbers are this because they don't want, because this is what they'll say, right? Well, they don't want to because the international pressure will be even worse. Well, that's not the same thing then. Now, what if you say it's discriminate? Well, discriminate arguably would possibly be even worse, actually, because if their intent was to discriminately target civilians specifically, well, the number should actually be even higher. Now, if you want to say it's genocide, but then your only argument to what I just said was, okay, it was discriminate, but they also, calmed down a lot because they don't want to kill too many people. Okay. Well, then what's the goal? Was the goal to kill enough to lower the population? Oh, wait. The population of Gazans in the world has gone up since October 7th. Now, you're going to see a lot of articles that say, well, it's gone down. I think they say 6% or something, except they're being very disingenuous. The problem with that is including people that just left the Gaza Strip since October 7th, 2023. But you wouldn't count that in genocide. Now, ethnic cleansing, that's not counted in genocide. In fact, the Genocide Convention of 1948 specifically says cultural destruction does not suffice, nor does simply dispersing a group. So those that want to argue about concreticide, that doesn't count. So those that want to argue about, well, the hundreds of thousands that have left, that also has nothing to do with genocide. Separate argument we can have later. You cannot call it genocide, but then also say, but they're not genociding them because people would get too mad. Interesting. For example, during its operations in Gaza, the IDF routinely issued warnings. Phone calls, text messages, leaflets, urging people to evacuate areas about to see combat. So they've used tactics like roof knocking, so it's like firing a small warning munition on a roof to prompt civilians to leave before strike. It also prompts the terrorists to leave as well, unfortunately. They've established evacuation corridors, humanitarian pauses as high as 12 hours per day every day. They built 2 separate corridors from north to south. They rebuilt the Erez crossing that Hamas destroyed on October 7th. They opened up a second crossing in that area that they didn't need to. They allowed civilians to move to safer zones, like the Al-Mawasi zone, that many of them ignored. In fact, 500,000 of them ignored it at the early on in the war and stayed in northern Gaza, even though they knew it would be a red zone. Not just a war zone, a red zone. Most of the people by civilian have died, not from these safe zones, but outside of these safe zones. And then they lie to the international community by saying, oh, I was in a tent, so therefore it's a safe zone. That's not what safe zone means. What kind of parent? Because we're talking about the children, right? What kind of parent the Palestinians do to keep their children in these red zones? These are not the actions of an army trying to destroy a population. On the contrary, they indicate an effort to spare civilian lives while targeting a terrorist organization. Now, contrast that with Hamas's actions. On October 7th, 2023, Hamas launched a surprise attack that deliberately targeted civilians for slaughter. Hamas terrorists went house to house in Israeli villages, massacring families. They gunned down unarmed teenagers at a music festival. They kidnapped elderly people, women, children, taking around 251 hostages. Did you guys actually know there was about double the amount of hostages, but about half were rescued the day of, on October 7th? Hamas's intent that day was clearly to kill and terrorize as many Jewish civilians as possible. This is not up for argument. In fact, they were proud to say it before. They filmed it. Remember when they had the little propaganda stage? And they put pictures of the civilian areas, like the kibbutzim, saying we invaded these areas swiftly, I believe is what it said. Now they're trying to walk back. We'll get into that in a second here. And trying to say, oh, no, not really. We didn't really do that. Okay. It was an attempt at genocidal violence, because genocide is not defined by the amount of people. It's defined by the intent. Targeting people simply for being Jews. By Hamas's own ideology, as outlined in their founding charter, they seek the destruction of Israel. Not to mention the Jewish people, talking about in the end times how they will slaughter all of the Jews except for those that hide behind the Garkwood tree, whatever that is. So calling Israel genocidal not only lacks evidence, it grotesquely inverts reality. Hamas committed a massacre of civilians, yet accuses Israel of genocide. To be clear, there have been thousands of Palestinian civilian casualties in the war, an immense tragedy, but those deaths were never Israel's goal, and it's not at Israel's footsteps. The only footsteps is that Hamas and the Palestinians that support them, which, by the way, majority of them. And that's not an opinion. That's according to the PCPSR polling that has been done before October 7th, after October 7th, as recent as, I believe, last month. They were in urban warfare against Hamas, which bears responsibility for fighting from within the civilian areas. They hold no military bases. They have uniforms, but decide not to wear them when they fight. And yet somehow, when I ask people, why did they choose not to wear these uniforms, they all answer the same way, even pro-Pallies. Well, to blend in. Blend in with what? Well, civilians. What's that called? It's called human shields. Human shields is not when you take some child and you duct tape them to your arm. I guess that could be human shields too. That's not what it means. There's no Israeli plan or intent to eliminate the Palestinian people. If there were, we'd be seeing something very different than targeted strikes and calls to evacuate. The language of genocide is propaganda, and it's offensive in light of Hamas's own action. Claim number 2, the October 7th attack, Al-Aqsa Flood, was a legitimate military operation. That's their claim. Hamas's narrative repeatedly tries to characterize the events of October 7th as a legitimate military operation or a calculated heroic operation that was necessary and justified. Now, you hear this a lot from pro-Pallies. Well, according to international law, you're allowed to resist, be a freedom fighter. Except even if you're going to go with that as if they care about international law, because, taking hostages, babies, and elderly, that goes against international law. Fighting, even though you have a uniform and choosing not to wear one, not distinguishing yourself from the civilian population, that's against international law. But let's pretend they care about international law. You're still supposed to follow the additional Protocol 1 requirements. Hamas follows none of them. So, okay, anyways. Hamas refers to the massacre as the Day of the Glorious Crossing and describe it as a foundational historic victory in their struggle. Let's be absolutely clear here. There was nothing legitimate or heroic about what Hamas did on October 7th. It was a terrorist massacre of civilians, plain and simple. On that morning, Hamas fighters breached Israel's border from Gaza, swarmed into nearby Israeli communities, including small farming villages, kibbutzim, towns, and a large outdoor music festival that was taking place, for peace, by the way. These militants did not confine themselves to attacking military targets. They went after civilians wherever they could find them. They entered homes. They murdered families in cold blood. Men, women, children, even babies, brutally killed. By the way, there was actually a recent poll done by the PCPSR. I mentioned them earlier, just so you guys know, this is the Palestinian Center for Policy, Survey, and Research. This is like their Pew Research. Done by a guy named Dr. Khalil Shikaki for about the past 30 plus years. He's a Palestinian out of Ramallah. So it's not like this is it could be biased towards them, but this isn't like a pro-biased source. Anyways, there was a poll recently done that showed the Palestinians, when asked, do you believe Hamas did acts of, what's the word they use? Unspeakable criminal acts. They asked them, did they do anything that was, let me just look it up real quick. Here it is. Let me scroll down. This isn't the one I want to show you yet, but I do want to show you from this same poll, figure 7. I will ask you about a number of Palestinian actors and whether you are satisfied or dissatisfied with their performance in the current war. As for the Hamas movement in Judea and Samaria, what the Arabs call the West Bank, 85% were satisfied with Hamas, Gaza 52%. Still insane that the majority of Gazans, are satisfied with Hamas. But even more insane, it is interesting how the ones that didn't have to go through what Gaza did, the West Bank, are at 85%. Hamas leader in the Gaza Strip, Yahya Sinwar, pretty similar numbers, 52, 81 for the West Bank. And you guys can see the rest all the way down to the Palestinian Authority. President Mahmoud Abbas is at extremely low numbers. All right, now let's find the one I wanted to show you guys. Here it is right here. This was released in October of 2025, so just few months ago. And we scroll down here to war crimes and atrocities. When asked if Hamas had committed the atrocities seen in the video shown by international media displaying acts or atrocities committed by Hamas members against Israeli civilians, such as killing women and children in their homes, the overwhelming majority of Palestinians, 86%, said it did not commit such atrocities, and only 10% said it did. That's interesting, isn't it? These are documented instances of atrocities. People burned alive in their houses, women who were raped and tortured, parents and kids shot while huddling together at the Nova Music Festival, unarmed young people who were simply dancing and enjoying a holiday celebration suddenly found themselves being chased down and massacred. Hundreds killed there alone. By the end of the onslaught, around 1,200 people were dead on that day, the vast majority civilians. It was the deadliest single day for Jews since the Holocaust. Additionally, Hamas abducted around, like I said, 240, 251 I've read, from Israel and dragged them into Gaza, including toddlers, teenagers, mothers, elderly, grandparents. These are not actions of a legitimate military campaign. These are war crimes against humanity. There is no justification for it. Hamas's manifesto tries to rewrite this reality. It claims that the operation targeted only Israeli military sites. It actually says that. For example, it mentions attacking the IDF's Gaza division headquarters and other military posts near the Gaza border. Yes, Hamas did attack an army base and some outposts. That's true, but that was only a fraction of their offensive. The overwhelming focus of October 7th was attacking civilian soft targets. Hamas's document outright denies targeting civilians, calling reports of atrocities lies and fabrications by Israel. But that's funny because they admitted to it. In fact, I believe one of the Hamas leaders early on in the war said that, well, they didn't really know that the music festival was going on, but they had no other choice. So they admit to slaughtering people at the music festival. But if they had no other choice, couldn't you have just shot up in the air and had them run away? I don't see what you meant by you had no other choice. It's not like they were trying to fight you. They were running away. It insists that Hamas fighters only targeted the occupation soldiers and those who carried weapons. Blames any civilian deaths on accidental crossfire on Israel's own forces, even though most people by far were killed before Israel actually had full-on ground operations in those areas. So that's interesting. How do you have it both ways? Pro-Palestinians say, whoa, Israel's forces didn't actually respond, at least in full force right away, but at the same time, you guys are the ones that killed them all. Which one is it? At one point, the manifesto claims that faults occurred during the operation because the rapid collapse of Israeli defenses created chaos, implying things got out of hand unintentionally. This is a blatant lie, contradicted by extensive evidence from that day. We know from survivors' testimonies, from videos recorded, even from Hamas's own GoPro footage released later, that Hamas gunmen intentionally hunted down unarmed civilians. There are harrowing accounts, terrorists throwing grenades into bomb shelters where families, including children, were hiding. Was that because of the IDF collapsing? I don't understand. That's what forced you to throw a grenade. Militants setting homes on fire to flush out those inside, unarmed people trying to flee in cars or on foot, being ambushed and executed. These acts were deliberate, not accidental. If any Hamas fighter truly thought they were only supposed to engage soldiers, that they clearly disregarded that, and there's zero indication many even had such an expectation, given how prepared they were to massacre civilians. Some were equipped with handcuffs and incendiaries for kidnappings and burnings. Why would they be equipped with that if that wasn't the plan? In fact, evidence emerged that Hamas's leadership explicitly encouraged maximum brutality. The IDF later found documents, including a handwritten letter believed to be from Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar, instructing the attackers to inflict mass casualties and sow terror. The letter literally directed fighters to inflict as many casualties as possible in every house, behead them, shoot the heads of families, cut off their limbs. When you have orders like that in writing, it completely shatters Hamas's claim that this was just a clean operation against Israeli soldiers. The intent was to butcher civilians in the most horrifying ways imaginable to instill fear. That was the plan, not an accident of chaos. Hamas's attempt to label the October 7th massacre as a legitimate military operation is not just a lie, it's morally repugnant. There was nothing legitimate under the laws of war about what they did. They violated every basic principle. Distinction. They targeted civilians deliberately. Proportionality. The attack was purely to kill and terrorize, not achieve a concrete military objective. And humanity. By trying to glorify that day, Hamas is effectively promising that given the chance, they would do the same thing again. Oh wait, they said that. Claim 3. Hamas doesn't kill civilians and any civilian deaths are lies or mistakes. We kind of talked about this a little bit, but let's expand. One of the most outrageous sections of Hamas's manifesto is where they claim that harming civilians is against their morals. As Muslims, they actually state killing civilians is not part of our religion, morality, or education. We avoid it whenever we can. I'm reading their quotes, you guys forgive me. According to Hamas, any allegations that they killed civilians on October 7th or at any time are Zionist lies. Sorry, I'm trying to be serious for this video, but give me a break. And I don't even think pro-Palestinians believe that. And they even assert that such lies have been proven false by independent investigations. An absurd assertion, since all independent investigations and evidence points to Hamas committing grave atrocities on October 7th. Even the biggest critics of Israel that do independent investigations, like Amnesty, for example, have said as much. Let's address this head on. Hamas absolutely did kill civilians intentionally. I can't believe I'm saying this. Saying it's not in our religion or morality is beyond hypocritical. It's a systematic assault on civilian population centers with the goal of maximizing terror and carnage. If Hamas truly avoided killing civilians whenever possible, October 7th would simply not have happened the way it did. Hamas claims that they offered to release non-military Israeli prisoners, i.e. civilian hostages, soon after October 7th. Israel declined at first. That's what they said. Even if that's true, it doesn't earn them a gold star. The very fact that they took civilian hostages, including children as young as 9 months old, shows a complete disregard for the principles of sparing civilians. Because you can argue like, oh, I thought maybe this person was an IDF soldier. How the heck did you think a 9-month-old was an IDF soldier? Or how about an elderly Holocaust survivor? Hostage taking of civilians is a war crime. No way around it. You don't get to abduct civilians, then say, well, we offered to let some go early on and pretend that makes you humane. Israel's initial refusal to negotiate immediately, which Hamas highlights, has to be understood in context. In the immediate aftermath of the massacre, Israel was focused on securing its border and grappling with the horror of what happened. Hamas wasn't offering to return all the hostages either. They typically wanted a ceasefire and other concessions in return. In fact, if I remember correctly, they wanted Israel to do nothing about October 7th if they returned all these hostages. It's like, hey, we know we did all this, but let's just give you back something that's already a war crime, right, by taking hostages, civilian hostages. If we give you back the civilian hostages, why don't you just do nothing at all? That's ridiculous. Eventually, in late November 2023, a limited truce deal was reached where Hamas released around 100 hostages in exchange for Israel releasing a larger number of Palestinian prisoners and pausing fighting for a week, which I always found funny that even when you look at casualties, that was 1,027, I believe, prisoners, Palestinian prisoners that were released for that one Israeli. And one, it shows how much Israel cares more about their people than the Palestinians do. Why do I say that? Well, because if you think about it, the Palestinians are saying that they're about 1,000th the worth of an Israeli, because it's 1,000 Palestinians, according to them, to get back one Israeli. I'm just saying, like they're kind of saying it themselves. Hamas still held many hostages, and even after that truce, Hamas went right back to fighting. So their self-congratulatory narrative about releasing non-combatants is misleading. They use those civilians as bargaining chips. Now Hamas boldly challenges Israel to provide evidence that they killed civilians on October 7th, even taunting Israel to allow an international investigation. This is pure posturing. There's already overwhelming proof of Hamas's crimes. Forensic reports, photographs, videos, testimonies from survivors and from the terrorists themselves, some of whom recorded their actions on body cams or called their families to brag. You guys remember the video?
طب انا قاعد اكلمك من جوبا بسيم افتح الواتس تبع قول له وين شوف كيف القتله شوف كيف قتلك في ايدي يابا ابنك قتل يهود الله اكبر ربنا يحميك يا رب ربنا يحميك يا رب ربنا يحميك قاعد اكلمك من جوال يهوديه قتلتها وقتلت جوزها عصوا بايدي يابا قتلت عصوا
where he called his father, and the father didn't say, son, what are you doing? Like any normal father would. He said, no, I wish I was there with you. Rotten to the core, the society is. The idea that all those dead Israeli civilians were somehow killed by Israel's own bombs, or maybe it was just crossfire, is not born out of facts. Yes, there were instances on October 7th where Israeli security forces in desperation did fire on vehicles carrying hostages, shelled houses with terrorists inside that happened to have captives. Tragically, yes, it's reported that it's likely that some Israeli civilians were killed in the process. But this is not one, you guys know what I'm going to say, the Hannibal Directive! One, that's not the Hannibal Directive. The Hannibal Directive had to do with soldiers, not civilians. And also, it's not even in play anymore. And yes, I've seen it. The Israeli officials who have said that, yeah, it's possible use like the Hannibal Directive. We have to look at this in context, right? They're answering after multiple questions in an interview about just the idea, was people's lives, Israeli lives, put at risk during the fight on October 7th. Now, where people get this from, ironically, is from Haaretz, which, okay, we'll put that as a different video, different day. Haaretz title about the Hannibal Directive, and all the pro-Pallies and anti-Israel people worldwide, they read the title, and still to this day I haven't found one that actually took the time to read the Haaretz article. I read it. You know, even if it was accurate and true, even in the article it only mentions a little over a dozen people that could have been killed or likely were killed during the October 7th attack by Israeli. Like, for example, it talks about a tank shell hitting inside of a building in a kibbutzim that I believe killed 13 people, if I remember correctly, or maybe one survived, so it was 12 and 13 total. I believe the article said that there was dozens, if not up to 50 terrorists that were inside shooting at them, so they fired back. Yes, it's awful, but who put them in the position in the first place? That'd be Hamas. That's not the Hannibal Directive. And even if you want to give it a name, I'm sorry, do you not realize how ridiculous you sound? Hamas is still the ones that put them in that position in the first place. It's not like Israel woke up that day and like, wow, I really want to take this person out. Most people, by far, were killed or at least taken hostage before later being crossed into the Gaza border within the first hours of the October 7th attack. This is before there was any at least full-on force of Israeli forces. The vast majority of the 1,200 killed were directly murdered by Hamas. Claims of independent international investigations clearing Hamas are fictitious. There is literally none. No credible body has exonerated Hamas or found Israel responsible for Hamas's point-blank shootings and mutilations. Literally, there's none. I don't know where Hamas is even possibly confusing this with. This is just a lie. The Manifesto's assertion that Hamas doesn't kill civilians also rings hollow against Hamas's broader track record. Over many years, Hamas has fired thousands, tens of thousands of rockets intentionally at Israeli cities and towns for years with the explicit goal of hitting civilians. They have carried out suicide bombings on buses, cafes, pizza shops, targeting civilians. They've dug cross-border tunnels aiming to infiltrate civilian communities. Their very charter glorifies jihad and killing Jews. So for them to say killing civilians isn't in their values is absurd. You know what it is? It's because they do not see the word civilian or what is innocent like you and I in the West see that word. So it's like they're telling the truth from their point of view, but using our language to try to appeal to us. It's clearly a line inserted to make Hamas appear noble to a Western reader who might not know their history. It's cynical and it's false. To underscore the hypocrisy, while Hamas piously claims it avoids harming civilians, its own leadership privately acknowledged the reality. After October 7th, reports surfaced that Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar, who orchestrated the attack, sent out a message to other officials saying things went out of control, people got caught up in this, and that should not have happened. In other words, he admitted that the fighters went on an unplanned orgy of violence that even Hamas hadn't fully anticipated. So which is it? Either Hamas planned and approves of all of that happened, in which case they're moralizing about not killing civilians is a sham, or they lost control of their militants, which still doesn't absolve them of responsibility for unleashing them on Israeli communities. Either scenario is damning for Hamas's credibility. The bottom line, Hamas actions speak far louder than these written words, and their actions show a blatant disregard for civilian life, both Israeli and Palestinian, since their attack knowingly provoked a war that put Gaza's civilians in harm's way, and Hamas actively uses Palestinian civilians as shields, which we'll talk about soon. Claim number 4, Israel targets hospitals, schools, and journalists, while Hamas doesn't. Hamas's narrative accuses Israel of intentionally targeting civilian infrastructures like hospitals, schools, and journalists. They paint a picture of Israel as deliberately bombing these sites or people to kill innocents and suppress the truth. Meanwhile, Hamas in the document emphasizes that during the October 7th operation, which technically actually lasted more than just October 7th, they did not target any hospital, school, or place of worship, nor did they kill any journalists or medics. They challenge anyone to prove otherwise. Okay. There's a lot to unpack here. Let's start with October 7th. It's true that Hamas didn't blow up hospitals or schools in Israel that day, but that's simply because their attack was focused on open-air locations and residential communities. Israel's hospitals and schools were not the targets because logistically, Hamas struck where they could easily kill large numbers of people at a festival, on roads, and homes, not because of their morality. Although Barzilai, I hope I said that right, medical center was hit with their rockets on October 8th and just 3 days after that, Hamas did target places where civilians gather, which is just as bad, if not worse, because it means they were trying to, again, target more people. And notably, Hamas did kill first responders on October 7th. For example, ambulance crews and paramedics rushing to help the wounded came under fire, and some were murdered by Hamas. I don't know why they're pretending this isn't true. That is targeting medical personnel. Hamas gunmen also killed at least one journalist that day, Roy Idan, if not more. He's an Israeli journalist from Ynet News. He was among those murdered in Kibbutz Kfar Aza on October 7th. So Hamas boasts that they didn't kill any journalists or medics is, well, it's false. Like, completely. Now, regarding Israel's actions in the war, has Israel struck hospitals, schools, and areas where journalists were present? But again, context matters immensely. When Israel strikes a hospital or school in Gaza, it's not because they want to kill patients or students. It's because Hamas has been using that very location for military purposes. For example, Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza City, the territory's largest hospital, was also the site of Hamas's main command and control bunker located underground. Hamas chose that spot precisely because it knew Israel would hesitate to strike a hospital. Similarly, Hamas stores weapons in schools, fires rockets from right beside UN facilities, and uses mosques to hide fighters and ammunition. These tactics are documented. So when the IDF hits such a site, it's because it has identified a legitimate military target embedded there. By the way, this is allowed per international law. For example, for hospitals, Article 19 says that Hospitals should be protected, but it loses all protection when it's being utilized by enemy belligerents. Now, there's some requirements after that, but if it was just automatically wrong no matter what, why would international law label when it is okay to strike it? Why would there be any words on when to hit a hospital? Now, that being said, I think international law is something that only works when both sides are in good faith operating by it, and Hamas clearly isn't. I'm just simply saying because they love to bring up international law. I believe this conflict is directly a democracy going against a people that find international law to be a joke. And how do you fight that? The responsibility for the damage and any civilians hurt lies with Hamas for using human shields and violating the laws of war. Israel also tries to minimize harm even then, often giving warnings, as mentioned earlier, and in some cases, foregoing strikes if the risk to civilians is deemed too high. One can certainly criticize specific incidents or argue whether the IDF did enough in every case, but it is categorically untrue that Israel's policy is to target hospitals and schools as a goal. The goal is to target Hamas assets. If Hamas hides those assets under a hospital, tragic outcome can result, and should result, by the way. But that's on Hamas, and I'm not sympathetic to it. As for journalists, sadly, over the course of the conflict, yes, journalists have died in Gaza. Now, I find it interesting. I think they say something like 240 is the number, give or take. That's what they commonly say on the pro-Palestinian side. What's interesting is how many of those, Dave Chappelle, are accredited journalists? Why do they have to be accredited? Well, putting a vest on that you found or were given to and having an Instagram page with a phone or maybe somewhat nice of a camera, that doesn't make you a journalist. So when these journalists that aren't even accredited, when they work with Hamas or just put themselves in harm's way by going into red zones where Hamas uses civilian clothing and hides behind civilians, yes, it's very likely they're going to die. Much more likely than people who directly and purposely target accredited journalists, and a lot more likely than in traditional warfare. Of course it is. Now, there has been some that have been accredited. There was an Al Jazeera journalist who was killed with his father, who was a doctor. Well, why were they killed? Oh, they were holding 4 hostages in their home. So even then, if you're accredited, what's the reason? What's the context? I don't care if you're an accredited journalist or not. If you are working with Hamas, or if you're not accredited and you put yourself in harm's way because you have an Instagram page that says journalist in your bio, I don't have any sympathy for you. Now, take away all of those. Not accredited, those that maybe were accredited but were holding hostages, working with Hamas, collaborating them with it in some way. Now give me what the true number is. If it's not 240, then what is the actual number? When any pro-Pal can answer me that, then we'll have the discussion and see if it lines up generally with what you see in warfare, especially densely populated urban warfare going against a guerrilla warfare unit that literally utilizes human shields. As for journalists, sadly, over the course of the conflict, war zones are dangerous, and these reporters knowingly put themselves in harm's way to cover the fighting. Some have been killed. Some by Israeli airstrikes or tank fire. Some might have been killed by erratic Hamas fire. It's not always clear. But crucially, Israel was not aiming to kill journalists. In fact, Israel often coordinates with media, and does not benefit from harming them. It only generates bad press. What do you gain from it? Oh, you stop the truth from coming out. Really? Really? Does it? There's so many people, even non-journalists, that are filming. They have iPhone 17s in Gaza. It really stop? No. The only thing it does is create extremely harming press. It doesn't do any good for Israel. And if you're being honest with yourself, you know that's true. Investigations into journalist casualties have found that many of those killed were very close to active combat or embedded with Hamas fighters. Disturbingly, it also emerged that a number of individuals labeled as journalists by press organizations were actually members of or affiliates of Hamas or the Islamic Jihad, like I was mentioning. Sometimes even actively helping those groups, blurring the lines. Hamas's claim that Israel intentionally murders journalists is not supported by evidence. On the flip side, Hamas has a known history of intimidating and controlling journalists within Gaza. In fact, I had to look up the article. I'll paste it in this video about how there was a journalist that came out of Gaza that said that there was a metaphorical, if not literal, gun to his head. They told him what he was allowed to show. This has been long documented. This isn't even new. I don't even know why we're trying to pretend. Why are we trying to pretend like this is... Whatever. They only allow out the images and narratives that serve their cause and threatening or even harming those who stray. Do you think some of these people work so closely with Hamas and they're not being targeted or killed by Hamas because they're doing their bidding? Oh, do you think Hamas is such good people that they won't hurt somebody even if it's a Palestinian? Yahya Sinwar was known as the butcher of Khan Yunis, not because he butchered Israelis, but because he butchered Palestinians. In fact, he is a co-founder of an organization that actually predates Hamas, that when Hamas was created, took them on as their security organization. So Hamas pointing fingers on this issue is pretty rich. In summary, Hamas's war propaganda tries to depict Israel as deliberately attacking civilian sites, but omits the reason those sites became military targets, Hamas's presence, and the efforts Israel makes to mitigate harm and brag that they kept to legitimate targets is laughable, given that their primary targets were people in their homes. Hospitals and schools should indeed never be battlefields. And if Hamas hadn't turned Gaza's hospitals and schools into weapon depots, they shouldn't be. The tragic reality is that Hamas wants the optics of blasted hospitals and dead civilians to fuel their Israel is evil narrative. That's the irony, is that pro-Palestinians actually want more dead Gazans than pro-Israelis. Oh my God, did you guys just hear what Nick said? It's true. Because they can use that. They know. Ask any pro-Hamas, pro-Palestinian, whatever. Ask them, do they truly believe militarily can they beat Israel? Unless they're extremely delusional, every single one's going to say, well, of course we can. You guys have better weapons. You can get stuff from America. Okay, so how do you beat them? You beat them through international pressure. Well, how do you get international pressure? Showing you guys killing civilians and babies and journalists. Oh, really? So you want more dead civilians? That's what they would want. It's not that they want to see their people dead, but that's the way they beat Israel. It's a gruesome strategy. Create human shields and propaganda scenes, then cry foul when occasions inevitably become casualties of war. Oh, well, first wait for the camera, then cry foul. We should not fall for it. Claim number 5, Israel practices apartheid. Oh, I love this one. Another refrain in Hamas's document and in their rhetoric generally and pro-Palestinians is that Israel is an apartheid state. They claim Israel is systematically racist and oppressive like the old South African regime, and they use this to justify resistance by any means. Let's evaluate that. But first, what's funny, obviously the word apartheid comes from the Afrikaans word meaning roughly separate, and South Africa practiced it. Now, how come, take this into account, they didn't claim, I think in South Africa it was like really abolished in the 90s. They didn't claim Israel was an apartheid. Let's say even if they thought the West Bank, right, Judea Samaria, what they call the West Bank, that was in 1967, Israel pushed Jordan out and took control of it. Even if they claim post that, how come they didn't call apartheid, Israel an apartheid state in the 1960s? How come they didn't call it in the 70s or 80s or even really the 90s? How come they waited for the actual South African apartheid to go away before they actually started making the claim, at least in large part, to Israel? If you don't understand the obvious answer here, it's because if they said it to Israel, right, while the actual real apartheid was going on, people would be like, what the heck are you talking about? They waited for people to kind of, the actual one to go away and for them to, trick the West into thinking like, hey, that apartheid thing? Some people either not alive for when it was in play, especially younger Westerners or very, very young at best. They just say, hey, you remember that thing that you learned in a textbook once or twice? Yeah, that really bad thing? Well, we're going through it too. It's interesting, right? Is Israel an apartheid state? No, it's not. Apartheid, first off, violation of the Rome Statute, if need be. It's when you have two separate systems under one single government. And that separation is based off of, in this case, you can say racial, ethnic group, religion, men versus women, etc., caste system, protected people. Except that's not really what happens. All of their claims, if not the majority of them, they're talking about separation of systems, not off of one government, but off of multiple, right? Well, there's a difference in roads. Right? They can drive different roads in the West Bank. They have different license plates. The Palestinians have green ones with white lettering or white green lettering, and the Israelis have yellow. Okay. Can Israelis, specifically Jews, technically no Israelis allowed to, but sometimes Israeli Arabs do. So really Jews, I guess is what I'm really talking about. Can they drive to Ramallah? No, they can't. Is that an apartheid? Well, no, they're not allowed to drive to Ramallah because that's part of the Palestinian Authority, Area A. Oh, interesting. So it's borders that's controlled by certain aspects by separate governments. Well, yeah. But, Israel, they hold full security control. Well, yeah, that's per the Oslo Accords. That's called treaty law. Treaty law works with customary international law. But treaty law being signed in by the Palestinians and the Israelis is what dictates this. That's not apartheid. Apartheid would be if it was, let's say, Israel proper, where it's fully controlled by Israel, is what dictates this. That's not apartheid. Apartheid would be if it was, let's say, Israel proper, where it's fully controlled by Israel. Security, social, everything. Civilian, all of that. It's all controlled by Israel. If they said, hey, if you're an Arab, you're not allowed to be in the government. You're not allowed to be a judge. You're not allowed to go here. You're not allowed to buy a house. That's apartheid. Actually, pretty much what the Muslims did to Christians and Jews, actually. Literally, that was apartheid. Of course, apartheid wasn't a word that was created till after, the Islamic Caliphate, so that's why we don't talk about it. But apartheid refers to a system of laws and policies that segregate and discriminate against particular racial or ethnic group, in this case, that have equal rights inside Israel proper, within its internationally recognized borders. Arab citizens of Israel have full equal rights under the law. They vote in elections. Is there some differences? Yes, of course, just like every other country in the world. But that also sometimes goes in their favor. Like, for example, off the top of my head, serving in the IDF. If you're an Arab, you can if you want. Like someone like Yosef Haddad, an Israeli Arab, he served in the IDF. But you're not required to, whereas Jews are. They vote in elections. There are Arab members of the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. In fact, even ones that are anti-Israel. Even the current government. I met one of them when I was in Israel back during last Pesach. In fact, Arab parties have been part of politics since the state's early days, during Prime Minister Bennett's coalition. For those that don't know, the coalition's like the actual, kind of sort of top of the government. They're the ones that form enough seats to be able to have majority. Sorry, if Israelis, if I'm getting that wrong, but that's how I understand it, right? If they don't have the majority, they work with other parties. In this case, it was an Arab party to actually form majority, and then that's what forms the coalition. That's why someone like Ben-Gvir, for example, is not part of the Likud party, but is part of the coalition. There have been Arab ministries in the government. Arabs serve as judges. One Arab justice sat on Israel's Supreme Court. There's an Arab judge who put a Jewish prime minister in prison. It's not something you would see in apartheid. Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis go to the same hospitals, same malls, same beaches. They hold the same passports. Do Arab citizens face social discrimination at times or economic gaps? Yeah, as minorities do in many countries. And Israel certainly has work to do to achieve we all have work to do to achieve fuller equality in practice, but that's not apartheid. Importantly, Israel's security measures, like checkpoints or the separation barrier or the Gaza border closure, for example, are not based on ethnicity or religion. They're responses to violence and terrorism. Again, it's kind of like the dolus specialis that I mentioned earlier with genocide. It has to be the special intent, not, oh, you're doing it for this, but kind of, does this as well. No. If Israelis weren't being targeted by waves of suicide bombings and shootings during the Second Intifada specifically, there wouldn't have been a need for these walls and checkpoints. In fact, even before the wall was fully complete, I think when it was at 60% complete, it dropped terrorism by 80, 90%. Obviously, a lot by the time it was fully complete. These measures are about security, not an ideology of racial segregation. Now, Hamas and others often conflate this situation in the West Bank, Judea Samaria, and Gaza with apartheid. Well, let's remember, Gaza has not been under Israeli occupation since 2005. Israel has no soldiers or settlers there. Hamas actually governs Gaza. Maybe not anymore. The reason Gaza is blockaded is because Hamas uses the territory to launch attacks on Israel. As for the West Bank, most Palestinians there live under the administration of the Palestinian Authority in areas A and B per the Oslo Accords, not under direct Israeli law. And the eventual goal, long stalled, was a two-state solution, something that anyone who knows me even a little bit knows I'm extremely against. But maybe that's for a different video for a different day. I'm against a two-state solution. It's two states delusion. Overall, this oversimplifies a national conflict over land into a false racial analogy. Over 2 million Arabs live as citizens of Israel, which wouldn't happen if Israel's aim was an ethno-religious apartheid state. In apartheid South Africa, by contrast, the oppressed majority had no rights in the state at all. In this ongoing war and terrorism that Hamas itself perpetuates, Hamas isn't fighting for civil rights or equality. Hamas explicitly calls for the elimination of Israel, so they're invoking apartheid is just a buzzword to delegitimize Israel, and ironically would create an actual apartheid themselves if they were in charge. Interestingly, Hamas's manifesto uses lots of these terms. They know it resonates with certain international audiences in the West to label Israel as colonialist, genocidal, apartheid, insert buzzword here. It's part of their information warfare. But as we've shown, these analogies don't hold up to factual scrutiny. Claim number 6, reversing victim and aggressor, denying Israel's right of self-defense. A core theme throughout Hamas's narrative is a complete inversion of who is aggressor and who is victim. And they're telling everything is justified because they are the oppressed party reacting to Israeli evil. By this logic, October 7th wasn't unprovoked mass murder. It was, in their words, a necessary step to correct the historical course. They portray the massacre as part of a noble struggle. Conversely, Israeli military actions are portrayed as wanton aggression, entirely illegitimate according to them. Essentially, Hamas denies that Israel has any right to defend itself or its citizens from attack. This is a fundamental distortion. On October 7th, Hamas was the aggressor. They initiated an attack of staggering brutality. It doesn't matter if you say, but what about this year? Which I will debate anyone on all of that and destroy anyone who attempts to debate me on it. But regardless, let's put that aside for a second. Israel, in response, had not only a right, but an obligation to its people to fight back and neutralize the threat. Self-defense is a right enshrined in the United Nations Charter, Article 51. In fact, when I talked about earlier how treaty law works with customary international law has a hierarchy, okay? And within that, the number one top of international law is just Kogan's norms. This is peremptory norms. This is something that, regardless if you're a signatory to this or that, it actually doesn't matter. Everyone, even non-state actors, are under just Kogan's norms, peremptory norms. Like genocide, for example, that's a peremptory norm, meaning that, let's say, treaty law, which works with customary international law as well, that cannot trump peremptory norms. Like, for example, I know this sounds silly, but bear with me. If two countries were to say, I'm going to sign a treaty to genocide you, and the other country says, yeah, I'll sign that treaty and I'm going to try to genocide you, it wouldn't actually be bound by international law because it doesn't trump. Do you get what I'm saying? Anyways, below just Kogan's norms, but above contemporary international law and even treaty law is the UN Charter. I think it's either Article 103 or 107 that specifically says this. Article 51 says, and I'm paraphrasing here, you know what, let me just pull it up real quick. Okay, there it is. Nothing in the present charter shall impair the inherent right of individual or collective self-defense if an armed attack, notice how it doesn't say like an attack by another country or something, it just says armed attack, occurs against a member of the United Nations until the Security Council has taken measures necessary to maintain international peace and security. Which, by the way, the security resolution was passed to try to do this, and it was Hamas that actually rejected it. But put that aside for a second. Nothing in the charter, the present charter, shall impair the inherent. Nothing. That means is, other than just Kogan's norms, there is nothing that impairs this right. And no country on earth would refrain from responding to an invasion and slaughter of its civilians. Yet Hamas frames Israel's subsequent military campaign in Gaza as though Israel woke up one day and decided to start killing Palestinians for no reason. They completely omit the context that they started this war. Hamas also revels in how October 7th shook the Zionist entity and altered the regional balance. That's kind of true, the second part, just not in the way they thought, claiming it as a great victory while simultaneously painting the Israelis as the real monsters. This is the moral inversion strategy that the document relies on heavily. It's Darvo also. Hamas commits the crime, but then tries to claim victimhood when Israel hits back. They enumerate all the suffering Gaza endured under Israeli bombardment, and indeed, the suffering has been immense. No one's denying that. Large parts of Gaza reduced to rubble, thousands of Palestinians killed or wounded, humanitarian crisis. But they attribute it solely to Israeli cruelty. And if the cause and effect, Hamas's actions leading to the war, don't exist. It's a classic tactic. Provoke a response and then use the consequences of that response as propaganda against your enemy. Somehow people fall for it. Well, Hamas will never acknowledge in this narrative as their own responsibility for Palestinian civilian suffering. Nowhere do they admit that by embedding their fighters in civilian areas, they increase the danger to their own people. Nowhere do they admit that stockpiling weapons in apartment buildings or launching rockets from school courtyards made those places targets. And certainly nowhere do they mention that Hamas leaders, many safely hiding in bunkers or even outside Gaza in places like Doha, hello Tucker, made a conscious choice to initiate this war knowing full well the likely devastating Israeli response. Instead, their document treats Gaza's devastation purely as evidence of Israeli evil, with no connection to Hamas's provocations. This kind of narrative is extremely toxic because it removes any possibility of accountability or peace. If one side insists we are 100% righteous victims and the other side is 100% a satanic aggressor, there's no room for introspection or compromise. By denying Israel's right to self-defense and refusing to acknowledge any Israeli security concerns as legitimate, Hamas signals that they are not interested in any real solution. They only seek to demonize Israel and justify perpetual resistance, which for them means perpetual violence. Claim number 7, distortions of history and context. Hamas's Our Narrative Manifesto doesn't just focus on current events, it also reaches into history to justify its stance. Throughout the text, they engage in historical revisionism. They rewrite or selectively interpret events leading up to the conflict to cast themselves as heroic and Israel as evil. For example, the document likely goes into grievances about Israeli actions over 2 years of steadfastness, implying the period of war from 2023 to 2025, framing everything as part of a long saga of Palestinian perseverance and Israeli cruelty. It glosses over or completely ignores critical context, such as Hamas's role in derailing peace efforts. The manifesto isn't going to talk about how Hamas vehemently opposed the Oslo peace process in the 1990s or how its suicide bombings were intended to undermine Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. It won't mention that Israel withdrew all settlements and forces from Gaza in 2005, giving Gaza a chance for autonomy and to just not act like barbaric people. Like, the only thing they asked was, can you just not be barbaric? Only for Hamas to seize power in a violent coup in 2007. Well, actually, I don't want to pass over this. The Gazans, Palestinian people elected Gaza just literally months right after Israel left in the last quarter of 2005. January 2006, they elect Gaza. Gaza, even like during the election, was launching, I think, a rocket and then increased to dozens of rockets very quickly. And then in 2007, that's when the violent coup happened and turned Gaza into a base for attacking Israel. That context is inconvenient for the narrative of we tried everything and had no choice but resistance. Okay. Refusal to acknowledge Israeli concessions, you won't read about multiple instances where Israel offered or implemented concessions, such as prisoner releases, territorial withdrawals, which I've always been against, but Israel's done it, ceasefires, allowing an aid, and how Hamas might have exploited or responded negatively to those. The document will instead cherry pick every perceived Israeli wrongdoing to build a case that Hamas's violence is somehow justified. Ignoring Hamas's ideology and extremism, the narrative uses moderate-sounding language for Western ears. It doesn't advertise Hamas's own extremist goals, for instance, that Hamas ultimately does not recognize Israel's right to exist at all and seeks its destruction. It likely doesn't cite Hamas's 1988 charter, which is full of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and calls for jihad. Instead, it might claim Hamas's aims are merely to end occupation or achieve freedom. In reality, Hamas's definition of liberation is the elimination of Israel entirely, not just an end to occupation of Gaza or West Bank. But Nick, I thought Hamas has even offered a two-state solution. They've never offered to recognize Israel. This is the concept of a hudna. It comes from the Hudaybiyah Treaty that their prophet Muhammad himself did. It's a temporary treaty. While you don't have the ability or power in the contemporary times that exist to fight your enemies. So you do a temporary truce until you can rebuild. Why do you think Hamas, in one of their deals, they said, if you give us a two-state solution, we will give you a 5-year peace deal? What happens at the end of 5 years? There's a reason Hamas's leaders refer to all of Israel as occupied territory and celebrate attacks deep inside Israel. Their fight isn't limited to 1967 borders, which ironically would just mean giving land back to Jordan and Egypt, but whatever. The manifesto, however, will not be upfront about that because it wants to appear reasonable to outsiders. I mean, I don't really know how to put it other than that. So when reading Hamas's narrative, one should be extremely aware of what's not being said. The omissions are as telling as the lies. By presenting a sanitized version of themselves, freedom fighters reluctantly forced into battle, concerned for civilians, seeking justice, and a caricature of Israel, evil colonizer, mass murderer, oppressor, Hamas is trying to obstruct constructive dialogue and any mutual understanding. They're preaching to potential sympathizers, trying to harden attitudes against Israel and attract support for their resistance by using buzzwords of social justice warriors and anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism. It's propaganda in its pure form. It's mixed with some small truths, maybe at best, with outright lies. And it omits anything that doesn't go for their narrative, complicates the whole black and white picture they're trying to set up, and it appeals to emotions. It appeals to emotions. It's the broader purpose of Hamas's manifesto. Anyways, it's worth stepping back and asking, why did Hamas feel the need to produce this lengthy document in the first place, especially in English for the world to see? Obviously, we all know the answer, but I'm here yapping, so I'll say it anyways. The timing, 2 years after the war started, at a moment when they were under heavy military pressure, suggests a few things. Shaping international opinion. Hamas knows it battles Israel not just on the ground, but in the court of public opinion. Actually, probably more in the court of public opinion. By releasing our narrative, they aim to rally supporters, influence neutrals, and maybe sway some critics by presenting their side of the story. They realize that images of destruction in Gaza have generated sympathy and anger worldwide, and they want to channel that by providing a framework that blames Israel entirely and absolves them. They absolves Hamas. They likely hope this narrative will fuel protests, influence politicians, and pressure Israel via international outrage. Maintaining internal legitimacy is another reason. This document was also probably intended for Palestinians in the Arab Muslim world, and a lot of people aren't mentioning this because of it being in English. To say, look, we accomplished something on October 7th. We have a story of victory, especially since the Palestinians, and at least in Gaza, 86% of them don't even think they did atrocities on October 7th. It's a way to save face and claim success, steadfastness, and will for liberation. Literally, it's in the title. Even as Gaza lies in ruins and many of their fighters and leaders have been killed, many, It tells their constituents and allies, don't despair, we are still strong, we are justified, and history is on our side. Propaganda as a weapon is a third reason. By writing down this narrative, Hamas is effectively issuing a manifesto to justify continued violence. They're doubling down on their ideology. Nowhere in this document is there any hint of remorse for bloodshed they caused, nor any openness to a peaceful path. Instead, by glorifying the attack and insisting it was right, they are laying the ideological groundwork to do similar things in the future. That is chilling, because it means if Hamas remains capable, they would attempt another October 7th style operation whenever they can, all the while claiming moral righteousness. That's the whole point. They're thinking about doing this again, so they have to start shaping the words now. The language in the manifesto, as some analysts have noted, is tailored for an external audience. It uses terms from international law, human rights, etc. to sound convincing. This is a well-honed strategy. Hamas often says one thing in English, or in messages for the West, and something entirely different in Arabic to its base. Internally, they celebrate the martyrs who slaughtered Israelis and vowed to continue jihad. Externally, they're writing essays about colonialism and liberation. It's two-faced, and we should recognize that. It comes from the Operation SIG, which I think I should do a whole nother video on that separately. As we debunk Hamas's narrative claim by claim, it's important to also realize really also emphasize the real-world outcomes of Hamas's decisions. The manifesto might be trying to put a positive spin on things, but consider what Hamas's actions have actually resulted in. Gaza has suffered terribly as a direct result of the war Hamas provoked. By late 2025, large swaths of Gaza City and other areas were devastated by fighting. Infrastructure is shattered, hundreds of thousands were displaced, and many lives lost. Hamas in its narrative calls this steadfastness, praising the endurance of the Palestinian people, even though most of them want to leave. And even before October 7th, actually, not most, but almost half, I believe, wanted to leave the Gaza Strip, at least temporarily, as if this some kind of grand achievement by Hamas. But many would say Hamas sacrificed the people of Gaza for its military ambitions. A responsible leadership would prioritize keeping its people safe and alive, not use their suffering as a badge of honor. 2 years on, what did Hamas tangibly gain? If anything, it lost much of its military infrastructure, many commanders and fighters, and perhaps the trust of some of its populace who saw the nightmare that ensued. Yet in propaganda, they'll never admit that initiating this conflict was a catastrophic mistake or miscalculation. Instead, they'll try to spin it as we showed the world Israel's true face, or we proved resistance is alive. That's cold comfort to Gazans who have lost everything. Now, that being said, the Gazans, I don't trust them at all. They're going to go right back to trusting and believing in Hamas, or if not Hamas, whatever forms from maybe the ashes of Hamas, because that's just who they are. Give it even 1 year, 5 years, they're going to look back and be like, you know, people forget. The manifesto crows that the world now understands the true criminal nature of Israel because of Hamas's actions. In reality, October 7th shocked and horrified most of the world. Far from making people see Palestinians as virtuous victims, Hamas's massacre largely drew condemnation and disgust. Now, I know what you're thinking. Well, there's so many people, though, Nick, that do actually see them as virtuous victims. Yeah, there is. Well, think about it. Muslims already make up a quarter of the entire world. 1 in every 4 people you see in the world, maybe not your country, but in the world, are Muslims. Now, not all Muslims support Palestinians or even some pro-Israeli Muslims, but, you know, generally that's probably not true. One friend that they convince alone, that's already half the world. I haven't even gotten into leftists, Marxists, communists, anti-Israel people from countries that are historically and contemporary anti-Israel. But even from countries normally sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, there's even some starting to shift the tide, even relatively recently. Yes, the plight of Gaza under bombardment did draw sympathy as weeks went on. But sympathy for civilians in Gaza, not support for Hamas. Most governments made clear that Hamas was to blame for triggering the war. If Hamas thinks October 7th improved the Palestinian position internationally, they are deluding themselves. Many nations that might have advocated for Palestinian statehood found themselves first having to denounce Hamas's terrorism. It set the cause of legitimate Palestinian aspirations back, not forward, by associating them with unspeakable violence. Hamas's document won't acknowledge any of that. Instead, it's essentially patting itself on the back. That's one of the most insidious parts of this narrative. It feeds Palestinians and others a story that glorifies a tragedy and encourages continued resistance at all costs. It obstructs any reflection, like maybe this path of endless war isn't working. Maybe Hamas's approach is hurting us more than helping. You know the old saying, a Palestinian will never miss the opportunity to miss an opportunity. As long as Hamas can maintain a narrative of triumph and righteousness, they can justify clinging to power and rejecting compromise. So, after examining our narrative, Al-Aqsa Flood, and contrasting its claims with reality, the conclusion is unmistakable. Hamas's manifesto is a brazen attempt to whitewash its crimes and manipulate public perception. It twists facts, outright lies, and omits crucial context in order to recast a horrific terrorist attack and its aftermath as something noble and justified. So we've highlighted how Hamas falsely labels Israel as colonial and genocidal while ignoring its own genocidal rhetoric and actions, glorifies and legitimizes the October 7th massacre, even as that day stands out as one of the most heinous attacks on civilians in recent history, denies deliberately killing civilians in direct contradiction to overwhelming evidence and even their own internal communications, accuses Israel of atrocities like targeting hospitals and practicing apartheid while cynically ignoring Hamas's role in creating those battlegrounds and the realities of Israeli society and the irony of what they would do if they were in control, apartheid, inverts the roles of aggressor and victim, erasing Hamas's accountability for triggering the war and the suffering that followed. By debunking these points, we're not saying Israel is perfect or that there haven't been Palestinians instantly caught in the crossfire of war, as all wars are. Far from it. What we are saying is that Hamas's narrative is a calculated lie meant to absolve them of all blame and justify continued violence. Accepting such a narrative would mean accepting more bloodshed and no end in sight to the conflict. The truth matters. The facts that Hamas tries to bury must be brought to light. Hamas chose to attack and murder civilians on October 7th. Hamas knew this would bring devastating consequences to Gaza. Hamas' ideology prioritizes the destruction of Israel over the well-being of Palestinians. This is just a fact. And when faced with the fallout, Hamas's main concern was to win the PR war, not to protect its people or seek peace. And so as viewers or readers of any of the articles that are talking about this, we should be critical of any narrative put forward by a group like Hamas. Scrutinize the claims, check them against verified evidence, and notice what's not being said. That's the important part. Notice what's not being said. Propaganda often works in the shadows of ignorance. Our job is to shine a light and dispel it. Our job, you at home watching this. In the end, no amount of slick words or documents can change what happened on October 7th, 2023. Hamas can try to dress it up as a heroic operation, but the world saw it for what it was, mass murder and terror. In fact, the reason they filmed it is because they thought that the world would actually respond positively to it. And the reason they think that is because that's how their people are. They responded positively to it. They did not realize that the West would not respond the way that they thought their own would respond, and they did. No manifesto can erase the reality of what followed. Brutal war that Hamas brought upon the people of Gaza by initiating a massacre. If there's ever to be a better future, it won't come through Hamas's approach or narratives. It will come through honesty, accountability, and a rejection of extremism. So thank you for taking the time to go through this with me. I actually aimed for this to be like maybe 30 minutes. I feel like, obviously I still have to edit this, but I feel like this is going to be like an hour and a half, maybe more. I don't know. Maybe I can edit it down to an hour. I have a lot to say. I'm a professional yapper. Anyways, this is my first YouTube video actually. Well, I have my live put up. This is my first. I'm just gonna edit and put together and make a YouTube. All right, I'm yapping more. But anyways, seriously, it's crucial that we confront propaganda with truth, especially on issues of life and death. If you found this analysis informative, please consider sharing it. Consider hitting the subscribe button if you're new here. Follow me, like the thing, do the things that everyone says. All the YouTubers say to do this. Do that, please. Stay informed and don't let terror groups like Hamas rewrite history unchallenged. Until next time.